Hi, welcome back to Museum Studies 644, the Art and Material Culture of the New York Historical Society. This is your instructor, Wendy Ikemoto, and I am here to introduce our guest speaker for today, my colleague, Dr. Debra Schmidt-Bach, Curator of Decorative Arts at New York Historical, who will be speaking to you about silver. Debra?
Hi students, welcome. I'm very excited to talk to you about how to read objects as documents. So I think we'll just jump right in. This slide is a picture of our Roy J. Zuckerberg Hall of American Silver. The New York Historical Society holds approximately 3,200 pieces of silver, approximately 1,200 pieces of hollowware. So those are vessels that held some sort of liquid, such as teapots, coffee pots, cups, bowls, pitchers, and trophies. And we have approximately 2,000 pieces of flatware. Flatware is what we know today as silverware, meaning forks, spoons, and serving utensils. The Historical Society's collection includes rare pieces of silver made in New York City and state by colonial American silversmiths. Most of the silver was purchased by colonial New York families. Most of the silver in our collection was purchased in New York City or state, and most of the silver was made in New York City. The collection also includes English and French silver, most often imported and sold by colonial silversmiths in New York. 18th century silver at the New York Historical Society includes several unusual forms, including tankards, cans, tea caddies, presentation cups, and some of these forms are familiar to us today. Others are anachronistic, so they're not familiar to us today. This is an example of a tankard. This tankard is one of the oldest drinking vessels in New York Historical Society's collection. It was made in New York City around 1700 by a silversmith named Cornelius Kierstead. The tankard descended through the de Peyster family, an old New York City family who traced its American roots to New York City when it was still a Dutch colony known as New Amsterdam. How do we know about the maker and owner of this tankard? Clues to this type of information and more can be discovered through a material culture analysis of the tankard and its physical characteristics. Analysis of the tankard's physical characteristics can assist us in understanding the history of the time and place that it came from. In this case, early colonial New York City around 1700. In the reading assigned for this module, Jules David Prown introduces the theory and methodology of material culture analysis. His essay, written around 1988, was one of the first to formally explain how material culture analysis can lead to interpreting three-dimensional objects as historical documents. If we apply Prown's methodology, we can begin to read this tankard as a three-dimensional document. Each of the tankard's physical characteristics can be read as access points. These access points provide physical clues about how and possibly where the tankard was made, how it was acquired and used, and whether it had a life beyond that of its first owners. Analysis of the tankard's overall appearance, construction details, the way in which it was designed, its ornament, and personalized engraving can all lead to avenues of inquiry about the history of the lives of the tankard's maker and users. And this type of analysis can assist us in uncovering the social, economic, and political events going on during the time that the tankard was made and used that are embedded in this object but not readily visible to the naked eye. So let's begin by posing a series of questions, and that's what I'm showing you here in this slide, about the tankard that will assist us in pinpointing its access points or physical characteristics. You can really do this with any object, but hopefully this will help to introduce the methodology to you. So the first point that I want to make that's very, very important is to ask what this object is and to take time to examine the object. Ideally, it is best to be able to handle the object, but if that's not possible, you can do that with images as well. Another good question to ask is what was the original function of this object? How might it have been used during the time that it was made? Was it functional or used primarily for decoration? Who may have used it? Who may have purchased it? The next question to ask, or to think about, is how it might have been constructed. Are there any physical clues that suggest the method of construction? How is it made? Can you identify its component parts? How many component parts is it made up of? Can you see evidence of the seams or joints used to connect the body and component parts? It's also important to identify additional parts. Does the object have handles, a spout, feet, a lid? Who might have made this object? Does the object have any marks that indicate who made it or sold it? Where might the maker or retailer marks be located? And what might these marks tell us about the maker? Next, look at the decoration. Does the object have decorative elements? Any that are applied, meaning layered directly onto the basic parts? Are there finials or decorative bands or decorative masks or other kinds of ornament? Is the object engraved? Is the engraving decorative, or does it have some sort of personalized inscription? Lastly, can you tell who owned the object? Does the engraving tell us anything about the object's original owners? Are there any other parts or decoration that might suggest how the piece might have been owned or passed down to other generations? And finally, what does the object say about the time period and place that it came from? So let's go back to the tankard and see what we can discover by analyzing its physical characteristics and asking some of the questions we've just reviewed. The two basic questions to ask are, what is a tankard, and how might it have been made? Tankards are drinking vessels. They were commonly used during the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. They were generally made of wood or metal, often used to drink beer, ale, or special kinds of punch. Wood or metal tankards were often used in taverns, and the slide that I'm showing you here is an image of the Bluebell Tavern, which was a popular tavern during the mid-18th century in New York. Silver tankards were not everyday drinking vessels, so silver tankards would not have been typically used at this tavern. Silver tankards were expensive to buy and expensive to keep clean and maintained. Let's talk a little bit about the way silver was made around 1700 when this tankard was made. This slide and the one that follows illustrate how different types of metalware, including the silver tankard, were made in the American colonies. This is Pewter's banner from the New York Historical Society collection, used as part of a procession, a parade, to celebrate the ratification of the Constitution by the state of New York. It's a very important artifact of New York and American life immediately following the American Revolution, but it also shows one of the earliest illustrations of a colonial American workshop. Here you see in the workshop the pewters. There are 4 pewters. It's a small workshop. They're each doing different tasks, and they're working to produce utilitarian or everyday objects. Pewter is what's known as a base metal. It's a mixture of tin, copper, and lead or antimony, and it was a fairly inexpensive metal. Was relatively easy to make objects out of. It was fairly soft, and again widely used for some of the kinds of goods that are shown in the Pewter's banner, such as coffee pots, teapots, and then you see, I think, at the top, tankards. One of the best illustrations of a working silver shop from the 18th century is this scene of a French silver shop from Denis Diderot's encyclopedia. In this image, you see 6 different craftsmen at work. An apprentice is pouring molten silver into an ingot mold. Behind him are 2 craftsmen taking an ingot mold and turning that into a flattened disc that they then would hand over to the craftsman labeled B, who is raising silver. So the first step would be to take that disc and to create a center punch in the middle of the disc. And then the silversmith would slowly hammer concentric circles around that center punch. So that's known as raising silver. This is the way silver was made for centuries, up until about 1800 in the United States. So let's identify some of the basic component parts of our tankard. In this image, you see the lid at top, you see a hinge, you see a handle, the overall body, and a base. So those are the basic component parts that make up this tankard. Keeping the basic components in mind, how might these parts have been attached or joined to the body of the tankard? It's important to look for elements known as joints. So those are intersections where parts might be joined to another part. Seams, so places where different metal was joined together from one piece. Or other indications of construction, such as a center punch, which you see at the top of this tankard. In this image, I'm showing you additional details of seams, joints, and center punches. So if we look at the side profile of the tankard, you see its joints at the two different locations where the handle is attached to the body. You also see areas on the base where the tankard has applied decoration, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Then next to that, you see two images of center punches. The top image shows you a center punch on the lid of the tankard, and the bottom image shows you a center punch on the bottom of the tankard. The other thing to notice in this slide is around the edges of the bottom, you see evidence of what's known as solder. Solder was a slightly softer metal mix with silver and other metals. And solder was essentially the glue that silversmiths used to put together different parts of silver and keep them tightly attached. Next, it is important to identify any additional applied ornament or decoration. Here we can identify, starting from top to bottom, the thumb piece, a handle terminal, which goes at the bottom, applied decoration. So the applied decoration is above the base band at the bottom, and you see a meander wire, and then above that is something known as cut card decoration. Cut card decoration and meander wire are important characteristics to keep in mind. Early American tankards had very different characteristics, particularly those made in Massachusetts, New York, and Philadelphia. Early New York tankards tended to have many of the elements you see here. Flat lids, like this tankard has, with crenellated flanges, so the front looks somewhat serrated, straight sides, cocoon thumb pieces, such as the one that you see here, and the use of the meander wire and cut card decoration. These physical characteristics can suggest the cultural backgrounds of the makers and initial owners of objects. In New York, these characteristics are distinctive to silversmiths with Dutch or Huguenot ancestry. Often they were from or trained by immigrant artisans who originally came from Holland, France, and England. Next, it is important to think about how we might determine who made this tankard. Are there any marks or physical indications about who made the tankard? Here we see that this tankard has a maker's mark, the CK initial. Maker's marks in general have been widely studied. In this case, the CK stands for Cornelius Kerstead, a prolific silversmith active in colonial New York and Connecticut during the 1700s. There are 17 tankards that survive that were made by Kerstead, which is a lot for a colonial silversmith. His tankards are often similar, and they use that New York formula. This tankard, however, is slightly less elaborate than some of his more outstanding work. Surviving silver from Kerstead can be quite elaborate, and he made several types of ceremonial cups, silver cups, for some of the wealthiest New Yorkers of the period. Here I'm showing you some other maker's marks. In the slide with the bowl, this is something known as a brandywine bowl. Again, a bowl used for ceremonies in early New York. And it is marked, and you see the mark above the flower in the front, by a silversmith named Benjamin Wynkoop. Benjamin Wynkoop was active about the same period when Cornelius Kerstead was active, and also made some very elaborate silver. Benjamin Wynkoop, like Kerstedt, was descended from Dutch immigrants to New York. So he brings that Dutch ancestry with him and brings them to his silver pieces. The can, which is another type of colonial drinking vessel, next to the Wynkoop piece, was marked and made by a silversmith named Meyer Myers. Meyer Myers was active during the mid-18th century, and Meyer Myers had a series of different types of marks that have been widely studied and can now be associated with different time periods during the time that he was working. Interestingly, also, Meyer Myers was a Jewish silversmith, which was very unusual in colonial New York and in any of the colonies. Next, it is important to think about how we might learn about the history of the owners of the tankard. In this case, we see some personalized engravings that lead to some clues, and it's very important to think about whether or not any of the ornament is personalized or just ornament that's used for decorative purposes. On this tankard, there are two different types of personalized engraving. One is hard to see. If you look at the handle, you see a very shadow of a lightly engraved A.P. Then on the front of the tankard, you see a very elaborate engraving that relates to a man named William Axtell de Peyster. These two types of engravings help to give us a lot of information about the owners of this tankard. Let's start with the AP on the handle. The AP relates to a man named Abraham de Peyster. Abraham de Peyster was born in 1657 and was a New York City merchant. He was one of the wealthiest New Yorkers of the period when he was alive. He was a very prominent merchant. He served as a mayor of New York from 1691 to 1693 and briefly served as a governor of the colony. This tankard is very unusual among the New York Historical Society tankards because it only has two initials, those of Abraham de Peyster. Many of the tankards in the Historical Society's collection have initials that indicate a couple or a marriage. This suggests that the tankard was a symbol of power for Mr. de Peyster. Often, the tankards suggest, if they have initials related to a marriage, that it was an anniversary gift or something that was used to celebrate or mark the occasion of that type of union. One important initial question you can also ask about silver is whether or not it was gendered. So was the silver intended to be used by a man, a woman, a child, a boy, a girl, and did it maintain that type of gendering throughout its lifetime? The second engraving is the engraving related to William Axtell de Peyster. William Axtell de Peyster was a fourth generation removed from the original owner, and the tankard descended through 4 generations of de Peyster men. William Axtell de Peyster was born in Canada. His father, Captain Abraham de Peyster, was an officer in the American Loyalist militia. So they were on the other side of the revolutionary cause and sympathized with the British. His father fled to Canada after the American Revolution, like many Loyalists did, and that's why William Axtell de Peyster was born there. William returned, though, to New York as a young adult and became a China trade merchant. He served on the New York City Common Council, and he probably had this tankard engraved after he inherited it. When his mother passed away in 1839, he probably inherited it from her. The engraving that you see on the tankard, and here I'm showing you a detail of the engraving, is very much very similar to a book plate that William Axtell de Peyster used for his own personal libraries. So we believe that his engraving, which was applied later on when he finally inherited the tankard, was used as a model for the tankard's engraving. Later or additional engraving can sometimes detract from the value or importance of a piece of silver, but this engraving, updated during the 19th century, highlights the family ownership, the descent, and again the legacy of this tankard being passed from De Peyster men. So using these types of questions as starting points, material culture analysis can be applied to any type of object, whether antique or modern, even a paper cup. Careful examination of physical characteristics can lead to important clues about the time and place where objects were made, used, and displayed. Identification of these physical characteristics can also be read as documents of how people in the past considered or related to objects, and can lead to greater understanding about earlier time periods. Thank you very much.